The Cold War is usually described as a period of tension between two superpowers that never quite became a shooting war. That description is technically accurate and deeply misleading. The Cold War was a period of continuous military action, covert violence, and systemic near-annihilation that the historical record has only partially captured. The guns were firing, the bombs were falling, the agents were dying. The difference was that most of it happened in silence, and the silence was not accidental. It was engineered, maintained, enforced through classification systems, institutional denial, and a bureaucratic apparatus so thoroughly devoted to concealment that many of the people operating within it didn't fully understand what they were part of. What follows is an account of 23 operations that stayed hidden for decades, not because they were small, but because they were too significant, too embarrassing, or too dangerous to acknowledge. Some of them nearly ended the world. Some of them did end individual lives by the hundreds. All of them reveal something essential about how the Cold War actually functioned, which was not as a standoff, but as a continuous, barely controlled series of actions and reactions conducted by institutions that had designed themselves to operate beyond democratic oversight, and in several cases beyond any human oversight at all. To understand these operations, it helps to understand the institutional logic that produced them. Both the United States and the Soviet Union, in the years after 1945, found themselves in possession of weapons capable of ending civilization, and simultaneously found themselves operating in a world where the information needed to make rational decisions was almost always incomplete, frequently false, and occasionally fabricated by their own agencies. The result was a decision-making environment in which caution was structurally difficult and escalation was structurally easy. The systems built to manage nuclear war were not designed to prevent it in any absolute sense. They were designed to ensure that if war began, the response would be fast enough, large enough, and distributed enough to survive a first strike. That design logic, which was rational given the assumptions, also meant that the systems themselves were capable of initiating catastrophic responses to events that had not actually occurred. This is not a side note. It is the central fact of the Cold War, and it runs through nearly every operation described here. The first of these operations to receive attention was one that the American public was not told about for nearly 40 years. In January of 1961, a B-52 bomber carrying two Mark 39 thermonuclear weapons broke apart in flight over Goldsboro, North Carolina. The aircraft had been on a routine airborne alert mission, the kind that kept nuclear-armed bombers in the air around the clock as a hedge against a Soviet first strike that might destroy ground-based assets before they could be launched. The breakup scattered wreckage and both weapons across farmland. One of the bombs fell in a relatively controlled manner and was recovered largely intact. The other weapon went through a sequence that, according to documents declassified decades later, came extraordinarily close to detonation. 3 of the 4 safety mechanisms on that weapon failed. The 4th held. The yield of each weapon was approximately 3 to 4 megatons, roughly 250 times the yield of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The fallout pattern from a ground detonation at Goldsboro would have extended across a significant portion of the eastern United States under prevailing wind conditions. The government acknowledged the crash. It did not acknowledge for decades how close the weapons had come to detonating. A later analysis by a nuclear safety expert who reviewed declassified documents concluded that only a single low-voltage switch stood between that January morning and a nuclear explosion on American soil. That information was withheld not because it was operationally sensitive in any ongoing way, but because its release would have destabilized public confidence in the very airborne alert program that was considered essential to deterrence. The Airborne Alert Program itself, known as Operation Chrome Dome, continued for years after Goldsboro. It was an operation explicitly designed to keep nuclear weapons in the air at all times over the Arctic and the Atlantic, positioned so that even a surprise Soviet attack could not eliminate the American retaliatory capacity. The logic was sound. The execution produced a series of accidents that, taken together, represent one of the least examined chapters in the history of nuclear risk. In 1966, a B-52 on a Chrome Dome mission collided with a refueling tanker over Palomares, Spain. 4 hydrogen bombs fell onto Spanish soil and into the Mediterranean Sea. 3 of the 4 weapons were recovered on land, but their conventional explosives had detonated on impact, scattering plutonium across several square kilometers of farmland. The 4th weapon sank in the Mediterranean and was not recovered for nearly 3 months. During that period, the American and Spanish governments conducted a massive, largely secret search operation while publicly maintaining that the situation was fully under control. The soil contamination at Palomares was partially remediated, but decades later, elevated levels of radioactive contamination remained detectable in the area. The Spanish government and the United States continued to negotiate over the cleanup well into the 21st century. In 1968, another B-52 on a Chrome Dome mission crashed near Thule Air Base in Greenland. All 4 nuclear weapons on board were destroyed in the resulting fire, and their radioactive materials were dispersed across the ice. The cleanup operation, which involved hundreds of American and Danish personnel, recovered most, but not all of the contaminated material. A classified component of that cleanup, involving the search for a missing nuclear weapon primary, was not publicly disclosed for decades. Chrome Dome was terminated after the Thule accident, but the institutional culture that had produced it did not change. The military organizations responsible for nuclear weapons continued to operate under assumptions about acceptable risk that would have been considered extraordinary in any other context. The reason was systemic. The deterrence framework required that nuclear weapons be survivable, deployable, and credible. Each of those requirements pushed in the direction of keeping weapons active, mobile, and ready. The safety requirements pushed in the opposite direction. The resolution of that tension, in practice, consistently favored readiness over safety, because the institutional incentive structure rewarded operational capability and treated accidents as management problems rather than systemic failures. While American aircraft were scattering nuclear materials across the Spanish countryside, Soviet submarines were conducting their own operations with comparable levels of risk and considerably less public acknowledgement. The Soviet submarine program of the Cold War period was characterized by extraordinary ambition, chronic technical deficiencies, and a command culture that suppressed the reporting of problems at every level of the hierarchy. The result was a casualty rate among Soviet submarine personnel that bore no resemblance to what the Soviet government was willing to admit. One of the most significant incidents occurred in October of 1986, when the Soviet ballistic missile submarine K-2-19 suffered an explosion in one of its missile tubes while operating in the Atlantic Ocean. The explosion was caused by a fuel leak, a known problem with the liquid-fueled missiles carried by that class of submarine. The crew fought to save the ship. A 20-year-old sailor named Sergei Preminin manually closed the reactor control rods to prevent a meltdown, a procedure that required entering the reactor compartment alone. He completed the task. He could not get out. The reactor compartment had sealed around him. His crewmates, following procedures, could not open the hatch against the pressure differential. Preminin died in the reactor compartment. The submarine sank 3 days later in water too deep for recovery. The Soviet government acknowledged the sinking, but provided no details about the circumstances. Preminin was eventually recognized as a hero, but only after the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. What made K-2-19 particularly significant from a strategic perspective was not just the loss of the submarine, but what it represented about the state of the Soviet submarine force more broadly. The liquid-fueled missile technology used on that class of submarine was known to be dangerous. The corrosion problems that led to fuel leaks were documented. The command culture that discouraged reporting those problems was understood by senior officers to be a structural feature of the system, not an aberration. The Soviets continued operating that class of submarine because the alternative, acknowledging the problems and taking them out of service, would have reduced the visible size of their deterrent force. Deterrence required the appearance of capability even when the actual capability was compromised. This logic, which governed decisions on both sides, meant that systems known to be dangerous were kept operational and that the people operating them were not always told how dangerous they were. The American submarine program had its own concealed history. In April of 1963, the USS Thresher, a nuclear-powered attack submarine, sank during deep-diving tests in the North Atlantic. All 129 crew members and shipyard personnel on board died. The Navy conducted an investigation and provided a public account of the probable cause, which involved a flooding casualty that led to loss of depth control. What was less thoroughly discussed was the broader context of quality control failures in the nuclear submarine construction program that had been documented before the Thresher was lost. The investigation, conducted largely within the Navy, identified multiple systemic issues. A safety program was instituted in response. The full scope of what the investigation found, and the degree to which known problems had been present before the sinking, remained classified for years. The loss of the Thresher was public. The institutional record of the warnings that preceded it was not. 5 years later, in May of 1968, the USS Scorpion disappeared in the Atlantic Ocean while returning to its home port. 99 crew members died. The Navy's Court of Inquiry concluded that the exact cause could not be determined. Several theories were examined, including the possibility that the submarine had been sunk by a Soviet vessel. That theory was not supported by the evidence reviewed by the inquiry, but it was seriously considered, which itself illustrates the atmosphere of the period. The loss of the Scorpion, coming just months after the loss of the Israeli submarine Dakar and the French submarine Minerve, suggested to some analysts that the Atlantic Ocean was considerably more dangerous for submarines than the official record indicated. The Scorpion's wreck was located and photographed. The images were classified. Decades later, when some of the documentation became available, it suggested that the most likely cause was an accident involving one of the submarine's own weapons, specifically a torpedo that activated inside the tube. That possibility had been considered by the inquiry and not publicly disclosed. The submarine incidents were representative of a broader pattern in which military accidents were systematically managed as public relations problems rather than safety problems. The institutional logic was straightforward. Acknowledging the full scope of accidents would have provided adversaries with information about vulnerabilities, would have undermined public support for expensive military programs, and would have created legal and political liabilities. The classification system provided a mechanism for managing this tension that was available to military and intelligence organizations in a way that was not available to civilian industries. When a commercial aircraft crashed, the investigation was public. When a nuclear submarine sank, the investigation was classified. The difference was not accidental. It was a design feature of the national security state that had been constructed in the post-war period. Among the operations that remained hidden for the longest time was a program that went by the name Project Azorian, though it was also known by other designations at various points in its history. In 1968, a Soviet Golf-class submarine designated K-129 sank in the Pacific Ocean, taking with it its crew of approximately 98 men, its nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles, and its cryptographic equipment. The Soviets searched for the submarine extensively, but were unable to locate it. American intelligence assets, including hydrophone networks designed to detect submarine activity, had tracked the loss event and had a reasonably precise location for the wreck. The Central Intelligence Agency, working with the Defense Intelligence Agency and several defense contractors, developed a plan to recover the submarine from the ocean floor at a depth of approximately 16,000 feet. The plan involved constructing a specialized recovery vessel undercover as a commercial deep-sea mining operation. The ship was the Glomar Explorer, ostensibly operated by a company controlled by Howard Hughes. The cover story was that the ship was engaged in experimental manganese nodule mining, which was a legitimate area of commercial interest at the time, and which conveniently required the kind of specialized heavy lift equipment that would be needed for a covert salvage operation. The recovery operation began in 1974. The CIA's specialized heavy-lift claw descended to the ocean floor and captured part of the submarine. During the recovery process, a section of the submarine broke apart, and a significant portion of the hull, including the section believed to contain the nuclear missiles and the most valuable cryptographic materials, was lost before it could be brought to the surface. What was recovered included portions of the submarine's bow section and the remains of some crew members. Those remains were buried at sea, in a ceremony that was filmed and later provided to the Russian government after the Cold War ended. The operation remained classified for years. Its existence became publicly known in 1975, when a burglary at a Hughes Corporation office produced documents that journalists began reporting on. The CIA requested a news embargo, which most major outlets honored for a period. When the story eventually broke fully, the government acknowledged the basic facts of the operation, but declined to discuss what had actually been recovered. The full operational details remained classified for decades. Project Azorian represented one of the most technically ambitious intelligence operations in American history, and it proceeded entirely without public knowledge under cover of a commercial enterprise, which itself required the cooperation of private corporations in a covert government operation. The pattern of using commercial cover for intelligence operations was not limited to the Glomar Explorer. Throughout the Cold War, the CIA maintained a network of proprietary companies, which were essentially fictitious or controlled commercial enterprises that provided cover for agency operations. Air America was perhaps the best known of these, an airline that provided air transport in Southeast Asia and that was eventually acknowledged to have been a CIA proprietary. But the network was considerably broader than Air America. It included shipping companies, construction firms, and other enterprises that could plausibly operate in areas of interest to the agency. The use of commercial cover created a structural ambiguity that was useful to the agency and problematic for the people who worked for these companies without always being fully informed of their employer's actual nature. It also created legal and diplomatic complications that required ongoing management, and it represented a significant use of federal resources in a form that was not subject to conventional budgetary oversight. Among the operations that received the least contemporary public attention, but that carried some of the highest risks, was a program that ran throughout the Cold War period under various names and configurations, and that involved sending specially equipped aircraft along the borders of Soviet territory to gather electronic intelligence. These missions, conducted by both American and British aircraft, flew close enough to Soviet airspace to stimulate Soviet air defense radars and communications, allowing signals intelligence collectors on the aircraft to record the frequencies, procedures, and capabilities of the Soviet air defense system. The value of this information was significant. Understanding how the Soviet air defense system worked was essential for planning penetration routes for nuclear-armed bombers. The risk was also significant. The aircraft were flying at the edge of Soviet airspace and in some cases crossing into it at a time when Soviet air defense forces were under standing orders to intercept and, if necessary, destroy intruding aircraft. The rules of engagement on the Soviet side did not require confirmation of hostile intent before engaging an aircraft that had violated Soviet airspace. The result was a series of incidents in which American and British aircraft were shot down, their crews killed or captured, and the losses concealed or minimized in public accounts. Between 1950 and 1970, more than 40 American military aircraft were lost to hostile fire while conducting reconnaissance and intelligence missions along and over Soviet territory. The crews of these aircraft numbered in the hundreds. Many of them died. Some were captured and held in Soviet prison camps. The American government's public position was that these crews had not survived their losses, a position that was, in some cases, false. The reason for the false position was that acknowledging the survival of crew members would have required acknowledging the missions, and acknowledging the missions would have created diplomatic and legal complications that the government was not prepared to manage. The families of missing crew members were told their relatives had died in the performance of their duties. In some cases, this was true. In others, it was not. And the government had information indicating it was not. The full scope of this program, including the number of losses and the fate of surviving crew members, remained classified for decades. When some of the documentation was eventually released, it confirmed that the government had maintained a policy of denial about the fate of these crew members that was not consistent with the information available to the agencies managing the program. One of the most consequential of the peripheral reconnaissance incidents occurred in May of 1960, when a CIA U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, flown by Francis Gary Powers, was shot down over Soviet territory during a high-altitude overflight mission. This incident became public almost immediately and produced a significant diplomatic crisis, including the collapse of a superpower summit that had been scheduled in Paris. What was less thoroughly examined in the public discussion of the U-2 incident was the context in which it occurred. The U-2 program had been conducting overflights of Soviet territory for approximately 4 years at that point. The Soviets were aware of the overflights and had been attempting to reach the U-2's operational altitude with their air defense fighters and surface-to-air missiles. The American assessment was that the U-2's altitude made it effectively immune to Soviet air defenses. That assessment was correct until the Soviets deployed the SA-2 surface-to-air missile system, which was capable of reaching the U-2's operational altitude. The CIA had intelligence about the SA-2's capabilities. The decision to continue overflights was made at the highest levels of the American government, and the decision was made with knowledge of the improved Soviet air defense capability. Powers was flying what was planned to be one of the final missions of the U-2 program over the Soviet Union, as satellite reconnaissance was expected to make the dangerous overflights unnecessary. The timing was unfortunate in a way that produced lasting consequences. When Powers was shot down and survived, the cover story prepared in advance, which attributed his presence over Soviet territory to a weather reconnaissance mission that had gone astray, collapsed when the Soviets produced Powers alive and presented his equipment. President Eisenhower ultimately acknowledged the program publicly, which was unprecedented for a covert intelligence operation and which created a template for how superpower intelligence activities would be managed diplomatically going forward. The U-2 incident illustrated a structural tension that ran through the entire intelligence enterprise. Intelligence operations required secrecy to be effective, but when they failed in ways that were public, the secrecy itself became a liability. Because the cover stories required to maintain secrecy in the face of contradictory evidence were frequently transparent and occasionally counterproductive. The intelligence agencies developed elaborate procedures for managing failed operations, including prepared cover stories, pre-positioned assets for recovery or extraction, and public affairs strategies for limiting damage when concealment became impossible. These procedures were themselves classified, and their existence represented a significant institutional investment in the management of failure as an expected operational condition. While the Americans were flying reconnaissance missions along Soviet borders, the Soviets were conducting their own intelligence operations against American targets. One of the most technically sophisticated of these was a program that involved planting listening devices in the American embassy in Moscow. The Soviets had pioneered a particular type of passive listening device that required no power source and left no electronic signature when not being actively interrogated by an external radio signal. One such device was concealed in a carved wooden replica of the Great Seal of the United States that had been presented to American Ambassador Averell Harriman in 1945 by a Soviet children's organization. The device, which became known as the Thing after its discovery, hung in the ambassador's office for approximately 7 years before it was detected. Its detection came not through American counterintelligence efforts, but through a partially accidental process involving a British intelligence officer who happened to be monitoring Soviet radio traffic and noticed patterns that suggested active interrogation of an asset in or near the American embassy. The device was eventually recovered and its design analyzed. It represented a significant technical achievement and influenced subsequent development of listening device technology on both sides. The Thing was one component of a much broader Soviet technical intelligence program that involved not just placing devices in foreign facilities, but systematically compromising the construction materials and equipment used in American government buildings in Moscow. When the United States built a new embassy building in Moscow in the 1980s, the construction was performed by Soviet workers using Soviet materials under Soviet supervision. The result was a building so thoroughly penetrated by listening devices embedded in its structural elements that it was considered operationally unusable for classified discussions. The American government spent years and enormous sums attempting to remediate the building before ultimately concluding that portions of it could not be salvaged for secure use. The full scope of the penetration was not publicly acknowledged for years. The decision to use Soviet workers and materials had been made for logistical and diplomatic reasons that seemed reasonable at the time, and the security implications had been understood to be a risk. The extent to which the risk materialized was considerably beyond what had been anticipated. The embassy penetration program was part of a broader Soviet intelligence effort that consistently outperformed American counterintelligence expectations during certain periods of the Cold War. This was partly a function of the different institutional cultures of the two intelligence services. The KGB operated in an environment where failure was catastrophic and success was required, which produced a certain kind of operational intensity. It also operated with tools that included coercion and control of the domestic environment in ways that were not available to Western intelligence services. The result was an intelligence service that was capable of remarkable operational achievements and that also produced catastrophic failures, including the penetration of its own senior ranks by Western intelligence and the loss of significant assets through internal betrayal. On the American side, the CIA's record during the Cold War included both significant successes and failures that were not fully understood at the time. One of the most consequential failures was the penetration of the CIA by Aldrich Ames, a career agency officer who had been providing intelligence to the Soviet Union since 1985. The damage caused by Ames was substantial. He identified virtually every Soviet citizen who had been recruited as an agent by the CIA, and most of those individuals were executed. The Ames case illustrated a systemic failure of counterintelligence procedures, including a failure to act on financial anomalies in Ames's personal life that were clearly inconsistent with his salary. The institutional culture that had allowed Ames to operate for nearly a decade before being detected was not primarily a product of incompetence, though incompetence was present. It was a product of the same institutional dynamic that affected all large organizations. The reluctance to investigate respected colleagues, the tendency to explain anomalies in ways that did not require uncomfortable conclusions, and the structural difficulty of maintaining counterintelligence rigor in an organization whose primary mission was something else entirely. The operational security failures at the CIA were matched, and in some respects exceeded by failures at the FBI and in the military services. The Walker spy ring, which operated from 1968 to 1985, provided the Soviet Union with cryptographic materials and procedures that allowed them to read American naval communications for approximately 17 years. John Walker was a Navy warrant officer who had begun selling secrets for financial reasons and had eventually recruited family members and friends into a network that produced one of the most damaging intelligence losses in American naval history. The Walker ring was not detected through counterintelligence work. It was exposed when Walker's estranged wife reported him to the FBI in 1984. The institutional response to the Walker revelation included a thorough assessment of what had been compromised and a series of procedural changes. But the full scope of the damage was difficult to assess because so much of what had been lost involved communications whose content was no longer current. The Soviets had presumably acted on the intelligence they received over 17 years in ways that were not always attributable to the Walker ring after the fact. The cryptographic vulnerabilities exposed by the Walker ring were part of a broader landscape of communication security challenges that both sides managed throughout the Cold War. The fundamental problem was that communication security required enormous institutional discipline across large organizations operating in stressful conditions, and that discipline was imperfect. Both sides developed sophisticated signals intelligence capabilities designed to exploit communication security failures by the other, and both sides experienced significant communication security failures of their own. The American Signals Intelligence Enterprise, centered at the National Security Agency, conducted a global surveillance program that was not publicly acknowledged until decades after its establishment. The program involved collecting electronic communications from around the world using a network of ground stations, naval vessels, and eventually satellites. The scale of the program and the degree to which it swept up communications that were not related to national security targets remained unknown to the American public for most of the Cold War and for years afterward. One of the most significant operations conducted under the umbrella of the Signals Intelligence Enterprise was a joint American and British effort to intercept Soviet communications through a tunnel dug under the Soviet sector of Berlin. The operation, known as Operation Gold on the American side and Operation Stopwatch on the British side, involved digging a tunnel approximately 1,500 feet long from the American sector of Berlin to a point beneath a major Soviet communications cable. Taps were placed on the cable, and the intercepted communications were transmitted to a facility disguised as a radar installation. The tunnel operated for approximately 11 months before the Soviets, apparently in response to a tip, dug up the cable and discovered the tunnel. The discovery was presented by the Soviets as an example of Western espionage perfidy, and it received significant international attention. What was not known at the time, and what did not become publicly known for decades, was that the Soviets had known about the tunnel before it was even completed. George Blake, a British intelligence officer who had been involved in the planning of the tunnel operation, was a Soviet agent. Blake had informed his Soviet handlers about the tunnel operation while it was still in the planning phase. The Soviets had made the operational decision to allow the tunnel to continue operating rather than immediately exposing it, because immediate exposure would have compromised Blake, who was a more valuable asset than the intelligence the tunnel was producing. The Soviets managed what communications passed through the cable in ways designed to minimize the intelligence value while avoiding patterns that would have suggested awareness of the tap. The tunnel was allowed to run for almost a year before the Soviets arranged its discovery in a way that appeared accidental. The full story of the Berlin Tunnel became known only when Blake's role was exposed through his arrest in 1961 and his subsequent defection to the Soviet Union after escaping from a British prison. The tunnel operation, which had been considered one of the CIA's major Cold War successes, was reframed as a sophisticated Soviet counterintelligence operation that had controlled the American and British intelligence agencies' access to information for nearly a year. The Berlin Tunnel incident illustrated a recurring pattern in Cold War intelligence operations, which was that the apparent success of an operation was not always a reliable indicator of its actual value, because the adversary had the ability to manage what you were seeing. Both sides invested significant resources in deception operations designed to lead the other's intelligence services to incorrect conclusions. The Soviets maintained a dedicated deception unit within the KGB that was responsible for developing and managing strategic deception programs. The American side had comparable capabilities, though organized differently. The result was an intelligence environment in which a significant fraction of the information being collected was either false or selectively true in ways designed to mislead. The difficulty of distinguishing genuine intelligence from managed intelligence created a persistent analytical challenge that neither side fully resolved. The difficulty was compounded by the phenomenon of mirror imaging, which was the tendency of intelligence analysts to assume that the adversary's institutions and decision-making processes resembled their own. American analysts consistently underestimated the degree to which Soviet decision-making was driven by factors that had no close American analog, including the specific institutional dynamics of the Soviet military-industrial complex and the particular psychological environment created by Soviet leaders who had lived through genuine existential threats in a way that shaped their threat perception in distinctive ways. Soviet analysts made comparable errors in the opposite direction, interpreting American institutional behavior through frameworks derived from Soviet experience. These analytical failures contributed to misreadings of intent that occasionally produced genuine crises. One of the most significant of these misreadings occurred in 1983, during an operation that remained classified for years, and that, when it eventually became more fully known, was recognized as one of the closest approaches to nuclear war in the Cold War period. The operation was called Able Archer 83, and it was a NATO exercise designed to practice the procedures for transitioning from conventional to nuclear war in Europe. The exercise was realistic in its design, using actual command and communication procedures that would have been employed in a genuine crisis. The Soviet intelligence services, which had been operating under an analytical framework that assumed American preparations for a nuclear first strike, interpreted elements of the exercise as potentially real. Soviet forces in Europe and the Soviet nuclear forces were placed on heightened alert during the exercise. The degree to which this represented genuine Soviet belief that an attack was imminent or a precautionary response to ambiguous signals has been debated by historians. The evidence that has become available, including a report by a senior CIA official who reviewed the intelligence after the fact, suggests that some Soviet officials genuinely believed for a period during the exercise that a nuclear attack might be in progress. The Able Archer episode occurred in a broader context of heightened Soviet anxiety that had been building throughout 1983. The Reagan administration had adopted a rhetorical posture toward the Soviet Union that was more confrontational than its predecessors and had announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, which Soviet military planners interpreted as a potential first strike enabler. In August of 1983, the Soviets had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, which had strayed into Soviet airspace, killing all 269 people on board, and the international reaction had further isolated the Soviet leadership. In September of 1983, a Soviet early warning satellite reported what appeared to be the launch of American intercontinental ballistic missiles. A Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov was on duty at the missile warning center that night and made the judgment that the report was a false alarm, a judgment that was correct. The satellite system had reported a false positive caused by the reflection of sunlight off cloud tops in a way that mimicked the signature of a missile launch. Petrov's decision not to report the alert up the chain of command, which would have triggered a response protocol that might have escalated to launch orders, prevented a sequence that could have become catastrophic. Petrov was subsequently reprimanded for failing to follow procedures, specifically for not having filled out his logbook correctly during the incident. The incident was not publicly acknowledged by the Soviet government. It became known in the West primarily through Petrov's own account after the Soviet Union collapsed. The Petrov incident and the Able Archer crisis occurred in the same 2-month period in the fall of 1983, which in retrospect represented a period of genuine heightened risk that was not recognized as such by either government at the time. The American intelligence community did not fully appreciate the extent of Soviet alarm during Able Archer until after the exercise had concluded, and reporting from a highly placed source within the Soviet intelligence apparatus indicated how seriously some Soviet officials had taken the exercise. That source was Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB officer who had been working as a British intelligence agent since 1974. Gordievsky's reporting on Soviet reactions to Able Archer eventually led to changes in how NATO exercises were designed and communicated to reduce the risk of misinterpretation. Gordievsky continued working as a British agent until 1985, when he was suspected of betrayal and recalled to Moscow. He was interrogated but not arrested. He subsequently escaped from the Soviet Union in an exfiltration operation conducted by British intelligence. The story of his recruitment, his service, and his exfiltration was not publicly known for years. The near-miss quality of the 1983 period was not unique. The Cold War produced a series of moments in which the gap between what was happening and what was believed to be happening was wide enough to create genuine risk of catastrophic miscalculation. These moments were distributed across the entire Cold War period, from the early years of the late 1940s through the final years of the late 1980s, and they occurred across a range of domains, from conventional military activities to nuclear alert procedures to intelligence assessments. The common thread was the role of incomplete information and institutional pressure in producing decisions that were made with more confidence than the available evidence warranted. One of the earliest of these moments involved a series of incidents in the Korean War period that extended the conflict's nuclear dimensions well beyond what was publicly acknowledged at the time. American forces in Korea operated under commanders who made requests for nuclear weapons that were seriously considered at the highest levels of the American government. The decision not to use nuclear weapons in Korea was not obvious or inevitable. It was made through a process that involved genuine uncertainty about whether their use would produce acceptable outcomes. Uncertainty that was resolved in favor of restraint, partly through concerns about Soviet and Chinese responses, and partly through practical questions about what targets were available that would justify the use of weapons of that magnitude. The deliberations about nuclear use in Korea were classified and remained so for decades. When portions of the documentary record became available, they revealed a decision-making process that was considerably less certain and considerably more contingent than the public narrative of controlled deterrence suggested. In the years after Korea, the American military developed war plans for the use of nuclear weapons that contemplated their employment on a scale that was staggering, even by the standards of an era that had produced Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war plan that was in effect from 1960 onward, known as the Single Integrated Operational Plan, called for the delivery of nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union, China, and their satellite states in a coordinated attack that, depending on the version of the plan and the circumstances under which it was executed, could involve the detonation of several thousand nuclear weapons. The plan was designed on the assumption that nuclear war, if it occurred, would be total. There was no provision for limited nuclear use within the initial plan structure. The targets included not just military installations, but cities, economic infrastructure, and leadership facilities. The estimated casualties from the execution of the plan were in the range of several 100 million people. This plan existed, was actively maintained, and was the operational basis for American nuclear forces for most of the Cold War period. Its existence was classified. The specific details of its targeting remained classified for decades. The scale of what was being planned was not communicated to the American public or to most of the American government. The development of the Single Integrated Operational Plan was itself the product of a bureaucratic conflict within the American military establishment over who would control nuclear weapons and how they would be used. The Air Force, the Navy, and the Army all had competing interests in nuclear weapons, and the plan that emerged reflected compromises among those interests rather than purely strategic logic. The result was a plan that, by the assessment of later analysts, was in important respects operationally irrational. The scale of the envisioned attack was so large that it would have destroyed the industrial and agricultural base of the entire Eurasian landmass, producing fallout and climatic effects that would have extended far beyond the intended target areas. The plan did not model these second-order effects in its initial versions. It was designed to win a nuclear war, and the definition of winning that it employed did not account for the degree to which the damage produced would have been civilizationally catastrophic, regardless of what happened to the adversary. The plan was revised over the decades, and later versions incorporated options for more limited nuclear use. But the structural incentives of the military organizations that maintained the plan consistently pushed toward comprehensiveness rather than limitation. More targets meant more mission requirements, which meant more aircraft, more missiles, more submarines, more funding. The institutional logic of the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower had warned about in his farewell address was not separate from the nuclear planning process, it was embedded in it. Among the operations that revealed most clearly how the institutional logic of the Cold War operated was a series of programs designed to ensure that nuclear weapons could be used, even if the command structure that authorized their use had been destroyed in a nuclear attack. The Americans developed a system called the Single Integrated Operational Plan Emergency Action Procedures, which involved distributing launch authority to field commanders under specified conditions. The Soviets developed a comparable system that went considerably further. The Soviet system, known in the West as Dead Hand and in Russian as Perimeter, was a semi-automated system designed to detect the signatures of a nuclear attack on the Soviet Union, and if communications with the Soviet leadership were disrupted, to transmit launch commands to Soviet nuclear forces automatically. The system was operational from approximately 1985 onward and remained operational after the Soviet Union collapsed, under Russian control. Its existence was not publicly acknowledged by the Soviet government during the Cold War period. It became known in the West primarily through the work of journalists and researchers after the Cold War ended, including a detailed account by American journalist David Hoffman in his book on the subject. The perimeter system represented the logical endpoint of a strategic doctrine that required assured retaliation. If you needed to guarantee that an adversary's first strike could not prevent a response, you needed to remove the human decision-making step that could be eliminated by killing the decision-makers. Perimeter eliminated that step, or rather reduced it, by distributing the decision to a system that would operate according to pre-programmed rules if the conditions were met. The conditions involved detecting seismic activity consistent with nuclear detonations, detecting the absence of communications with the Soviet leadership, and verifying the receipt of a specific authorization signal. If all three conditions were met, the system would launch. Whether it would have actually launched under those conditions was not publicly tested. What was known was that it was designed to be capable of doing so, and that its existence was intended to make Soviet retaliatory capability credible to an adversary who might have been contemplating a first strike designed to decapitate the Soviet leadership. The existence of systems like Perimeter illustrated how thoroughly the Cold War had transferred strategic decision-making from human judgment to automated procedures. The transfer was not instantaneous or absolute. Humans remained in the loop at multiple points in both American and Soviet nuclear command systems. But the direction of travel was consistently toward automation, toward pre-positioned rules, toward systems designed to function without deliberation because deliberation took time that might not be available. The result was a global nuclear system that was, by design, capable of producing civilization-ending outcomes through the execution of procedures rather than through decisions made in the conventional sense. Among the operations that illustrated how close the automated systems had come to producing unintended outcomes was a 1979 incident at the North American Aerospace Defense Command headquarters at Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado. A computer at the command center generated an alert indicating that a large Soviet missile attack was underway. Duty officers at the command center initiated emergency procedures. The National Security Advisor was called. Bombers were placed on alert. The procedures had progressed to a fairly advanced stage before an anomalous data point prompted a check that revealed the source of the alert was a training tape that had been accidentally loaded into the operational system. The training tape contained a realistic simulation of a Soviet attack, and it had run as if it were actual sensor data. The incident was not publicly disclosed at the time. A similar incident occurred the following year. In that case, a faulty computer chip produced an alert indicating a Soviet submarine-launched ballistic missile attack. The alert was evaluated and determined to be false within approximately 3 minutes. The procedures initiated during those 3 minutes involved placing strategic forces on a higher level of alert. The 3-minute window was not enough time to authorize a retaliatory launch, but it was enough time to move forces in ways that, had the Soviets observed them, might have been misinterpreted. The computer malfunction incidents were symptomatic of a broader problem with the integration of digital technology into nuclear command and control systems. The technology was introduced at a pace that outran the development of procedures for managing its failures, and the failures were not always immediately apparent. The distinction between a sensor malfunction and an actual event was not always easy to make in real time, particularly in a command environment designed around the assumption that the time available to respond was extremely short. The short response time was itself a feature of the strategic environment, not a bug. It was the product of the deployment of missiles with flight times measured in minutes. The short flight times were the product of missile technology developed specifically to reduce the warning time available to the adversary and thereby complicate their defensive calculations. The very capability that made nuclear weapons strategically useful also made the command systems that controlled them chronically vulnerable to the kind of malfunction-driven false alarms that occurred at Cheyenne Mountain. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 is the Cold War event that received the most extensive public attention, and its general outlines are well known. What remained classified for decades and what changed the historical understanding of the crisis significantly when it became known was a series of incidents during the 13-day confrontation that illustrated how close the crisis came to producing outcomes that neither side intended. One of these incidents involved a Soviet submarine operating in the waters near the American naval blockade. The submarine, designated B-59, had been out of contact with Moscow for several days when American naval forces began dropping practice depth charges to force it to surface for identification. The submarine's crew did not know that the charges being dropped were practice charges. They experienced them as an attack. The submarine was at a depth where radio communication with the surface was impossible, and the crew had been operating without reliable intelligence about the state of the confrontation above them for an extended period. Under Soviet operational procedures, the submarine's commanding officer had authority to use the nuclear-tipped torpedo the vessel carried if he believed the vessel was under attack and could not communicate with higher authority. 3 senior officers on the submarine were required to agree before the torpedo could be used. The commanding officer, Valentin Savitsky, gave the order to prepare the torpedo for use and indicated his intention to fire. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, agreed. The submarine's brigade commander, Vasily Arkhipov, who happened to be on board because B-59 was his flagship, did not agree. Arkhipov argued against firing and ultimately persuaded Savitsky to surface and re-establish contact with Moscow. The submarine surfaced, was observed by American naval vessels, and eventually withdrew. The nuclear torpedo was not fired. If it had been fired at American naval vessels during the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the likely American response would have been significant, and the trajectory of the crisis would have changed in ways that cannot be reliably predicted, but that carried obvious escalatory potential. The Arkhipov incident was not publicly known during or after the crisis. It became known to Western historians primarily through research conducted in the 1990s and early 2000s, including work done in connection with a conference that brought together former participants in the crisis. When the story became known, it was received as a striking illustration of how dependent the avoidance of catastrophe had been on the judgment of individuals who were not part of the official decision-making processes that history had focused on. Arkhipov's decision was not made in the Kennedy White House or the Kremlin. It was made in a submarine operating in difficult conditions by an officer who had reasons to defer to his commanding officer's judgment and chose not to. The Cuban Missile Crisis produced several other incidents that remained less thoroughly documented than the principal events. American U-2 aircraft continued flying reconnaissance missions during the crisis, including one mission that accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace over the Chukotka Peninsula while the pilot was attempting to navigate by stellar observation in conditions where his navigation equipment had malfunctioned. Soviet fighters scrambled to intercept the aircraft. American fighters were scrambled to meet them. The two groups of aircraft did not engage each other. The U-2 returned to Alaska. The incident was not publicly disclosed. In a crisis in which both sides were watching each other's military movements for any sign of preparation for attack, an American reconnaissance aircraft penetrating Soviet airspace was precisely the kind of incident that could have been misread as a precursor to a larger operation. Also during the Cuban Missile Crisis, an American ICBM was test-launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. The test had been scheduled before the crisis began and proceeded on schedule, despite the obvious sensitivity of launching an intercontinental ballistic missile during the most acute nuclear crisis in history. The Soviets observed the launch. They were apparently informed through back channels that it was a scheduled test. Whether this communication was received and credited in time to prevent any escalatory response is not definitively established in the available record. The management of the Cuban Missile Crisis illustrated both the successes and the limitations of the human communication and decision-making processes that were supposed to govern the Cold War's most dangerous moments. The crisis was resolved through a combination of direct communication between Kennedy and Khrushchev, back-channel diplomacy that allowed both sides to make concessions without public humiliation, and the willingness of both leaders to accept outcomes that fell short of their initial positions. What the documentary record also reveals is how many times during the crisis events occurred that were outside the control of either leader, and how those events might have produced outcomes that neither leader wanted. The resolution of the crisis depended on the decisions of those leaders, but it also depended on the decisions of submarine officers, reconnaissance pilots, military commanders at multiple levels, and the somewhat arbitrary fact that none of the uncontrolled incidents during those 13 days escalated beyond recoverable levels. The years after the Cuban Missile Crisis produced a series of arrangements designed to reduce the risk of future crises escalating in the same way. The most visible was the establishment of a direct communication link between Washington and Moscow, the so-called hotline, which was actually a teletype link rather than a telephone. The hotline was designed to ensure that in a crisis, the two governments could communicate directly rather than relying on embassy channels that were slower and more susceptible to misinterpretation. The hotline was used in subsequent crises, including the 1967 Middle East War and the 1971 India-Pakistan conflict. It was periodically upgraded as technology changed. Its existence was publicly acknowledged. What was less publicly discussed was the degree to which the hotline's utility depended on both sides being willing to use it in a crisis, and on both sides having a clear enough command structure that a message sent through the hotline could be received by someone with the authority to act on it. Both of those conditions were more variable than the hotline's public image suggested. Among the operations that illustrated how the Cold War extended into unexpected domains was a series of programs involving the ocean floor. Both the American and Soviet navies invested heavily in deep-sea surveillance and intelligence capabilities, and the competition between them extended to placing sensors on the ocean floor to track submarine movements, interfering with each other's undersea communication cables, and conducting operations in depths that had not previously been accessible to military activity. One of these operations, conducted by the American Navy in the early 1970s, involved sending divers to place wiretap devices on a Soviet underwater communication cable in the Sea of Okhotsk, the body of water between the Kamchatka Peninsula and the Soviet mainland. The cable carried communications between Soviet Pacific Fleet headquarters and its submarine forces, and the communications were transmitted in what the Soviets apparently believed was a secure manner, without encryption, because they assumed that the cable itself was inaccessible. The operation, which was given the name Ivy Bells, involved specially modified submarines that could approach the cable and deploy a device that wrapped around it and recorded the electronic signals passing through it. The device was battery-powered and recorded for a period before being recovered by American divers who periodically retrieved the recorded materials. The operation produced significant intelligence about Soviet Pacific Fleet operations and communications procedures. It continued for approximately a decade before it was compromised. The compromise came not through Soviet detection of the devices, but through a different channel. Ronald Pelton, a former National Security Agency employee who had worked on the Ivy Bells program, sold information about the program to the Soviets. The Soviets subsequently located and removed the listening device from the cable. The loss of Ivy Bells was one of several significant intelligence setbacks that occurred in the mid-1980s as a result of espionage by individuals with access to classified programs. The Ivy Bells program was representative of a broader American effort to exploit Soviet vulnerabilities in communication security through technical means. The NSA, working with the Navy and other military services, developed a range of technical collection capabilities that were employed against Soviet targets continuously throughout the Cold War. Many of these programs remained classified for decades after the Cold War ended. The ones that became known, like Ivy Bells, typically became known because they had been compromised, either by espionage or by accident, and the compromise had become sufficiently public that continued secrecy was no longer maintainable. The intersection of espionage, technical collection, and covert action produced some of the most complex and, in retrospect, most consequential operations of the Cold War period. One such operation was a program conducted by the CIA in Afghanistan beginning in 1979, following the Soviet invasion of that country. The program provided covert support to Afghan resistance fighters through Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, and involved supplying weapons, training, and funding to forces that were resisting the Soviet occupation. The program grew substantially under the Reagan administration and eventually included the provision of Stinger surface-to-air missiles, which proved effective against Soviet aircraft and which represented a significant escalation in the capability of the resistance forces. The program was covert in the sense that American involvement was officially unacknowledged, though it was publicly known that the United States was supporting the Afghan resistance. The precise mechanisms and the scale of the support were classified. The Afghanistan program achieved its primary objective of making the Soviet occupation militarily costly. The Soviets withdrew their forces in 1989. The program's longer-term consequences, including the role it played in producing the political and military environment in Afghanistan that developed after the Soviet withdrawal, were not part of the program's design parameters. The CIA's mandate was to make the Soviet occupation more costly. The question of what Afghanistan would look like after the Soviets left was outside the operational scope of the program as it was designed. The institutional logic that produced this limitation was not unique to Afghanistan. Covert action programs were typically designed with specific near-term objectives and limited mechanisms for assessing longer-term second- and third-order effects. The reason was partly structural. Covert programs operated under different oversight mechanisms than conventional policy programs, and the compressed timelines and security constraints under which they operated made extended strategic analysis difficult. It was also partly intentional. Programs that could demonstrate near-term results were easier to sustain politically than programs that required extended time horizons to evaluate. Among the operations that remained least publicly examined was a series of programs involving American and Soviet military activities in space. Both nations developed anti-satellite capabilities during the Cold War period, and both nations recognized early that the other's space-based assets, including reconnaissance satellites, communications satellites, and early warning satellites, were militarily critical. The development of capabilities to interfere with or destroy those assets was a logical response to their military importance. The Soviets deployed a co-orbital anti-satellite system that involved maneuvering a satellite into proximity with a target satellite and detonating an explosive charge. The Americans developed their own anti-satellite programs, including a system based at Johnston Atoll in the Pacific that used a nuclear warhead to destroy satellites at altitude. The nuclear anti-satellite program was eventually discontinued because its primary kill mechanism, which involved detonating a nuclear weapon in space, would have produced an electromagnetic pulse affecting a wide range of satellites, including American assets. The militarization of space during the Cold War produced a series of incidents that were classified and that illustrated the degree to which the competition between the two superpowers extended into every available domain. American reconnaissance satellites occasionally maneuvered in ways that suggested they were observing Soviet anti-satellite tests. Soviet assets behaved in ways that suggested they were monitoring American space activities. The orbital environment became a domain of competitive surveillance and occasional active interference, none of which was publicly acknowledged because both sides had publicly committed to principles of peaceful use of outer space that their actual activities contradicted. The contradiction between the public commitment to peaceful space use and the actual militarization of orbital space was representative of a broader pattern in which the publicly stated norms of Cold War behavior and the actual behavior of the parties diverged significantly. Arms control agreements were negotiated and sometimes observed and sometimes violated. The violations were typically covert because overt violation would have produced diplomatic consequences. The covert violations were sometimes detected and sometimes not. When detected, they were sometimes raised through diplomatic channels and sometimes not, depending on the broader state of the relationship and the particular strategic value of the information about the violation. The result was an arms control regime that was partially real and partially theatrical, in which the existence of treaties contributed to stability primarily through their signaling function, which was a communication of intent to limit competition, even when the actual compliance with treaty terms was imperfect. One of the most significant of the covert treaty violations involved a facility in the Soviet city of Sverdlovsk, which is now Yekaterinburg. In 1979, an accidental release of anthrax spores from a Soviet military installation in that city killed an estimated 60 to 100 people in the surrounding area. The Soviet government attributed the deaths to consumption of contaminated meat. The explanation was maintained for more than a decade. The facility was a Soviet biological weapons program operating in violation of the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, which the Soviet Union had signed. The American government had intelligence indicating that the Sverdlovsk incident involved a biological weapons accident, but the intelligence was classified and the public Soviet explanation remained the official account for years. The truth of the Sverdlovsk incident became publicly acknowledged only after the Soviet Union collapsed, when Boris Yeltsin acknowledged that the facility had been part of a biological weapons program. The program itself had continued operating throughout the Cold War period and beyond, as became clear from subsequent disclosures by former Soviet scientists who had worked in it. The Soviet biological weapons program was one of the most significant arms control violations of the Cold War period. It was conducted at enormous scale, involving tens of thousands of workers in dozens of facilities spread across the Soviet Union. The program worked on agents including anthrax, smallpox, plague, and engineered pathogens designed to be resistant to treatment. The Western intelligence services had partial knowledge of the program's existence, but did not fully understand its scale until after the Soviet Union's collapse, when defectors and declassified documents revealed its dimensions. The program's existence during the Cold War period represents a fundamental asymmetry in the arms control record that was not publicly known at the time. Among the operations that illustrated the role of individual judgment in Cold War crisis management was an incident in 1969 during the brief conflict between the Soviet Union and China along the Ussuri River. The conflict produced a period of extraordinary tension in which some Soviet officials discussed the possibility of a preemptive nuclear strike against Chinese nuclear facilities. American intelligence detected preparations that were consistent with such a strike and faced a difficult question about whether to communicate to the Soviets that the United States would not remain uninvolved in a Soviet nuclear attack on China. The Nixon administration made the decision to communicate through back channels that American neutrality could not be assumed in such a scenario. Whether this communication deterred Soviet action, or whether the Soviets were never seriously contemplating a nuclear strike against China, is debated. The significant point for purposes of this account is that the United States found itself in the position of implicitly extending a form of deterrence to China, an adversary against the Soviet Union, a different adversary, through a channel that was not publicly acknowledged. The communication and the deliberations that produced it remained classified for years. The triangular relationship among the United States, the Soviet Union, and China added a dimension of complexity to Cold War strategic calculations that was not always well integrated into the planning frameworks developed in the simpler bipolar context of the early post-war period. The opening of American relations with China under Nixon and Kissinger in the early 1970s changed the strategic geometry significantly and was itself accomplished through back-channel diplomacy that bypassed the normal institutional processes of the American foreign policy apparatus. The specific communications through which the normalization of relations was arranged, including the use of Pakistan as an intermediary channel for initial contacts, were classified. The policy decision was announced publicly, but the process that produced it remained opaque. The role of back-channel diplomacy in managing Cold War crises and in developing the framework agreements that defined the relationship between the superpowers was significant and persistently underappreciated. The public framework of Cold War diplomacy, which involved formal negotiations, publicly announced agreements, and official diplomatic representations, was accompanied by a parallel network of informal contacts, intermediary communications, and private understandings that operated in a different register. Some of these back-channel arrangements were eventually acknowledged. Many were not, or were acknowledged only in fragmentary ways that made it difficult to assess their full significance. One of the most consequential of these back-channel arrangements involved the management of the nuclear relationship between the United States and Israel. Israel had developed nuclear weapons, a fact that both governments found diplomatically inconvenient for different reasons, and that both managed through a policy of deliberate ambiguity. The United States had intelligence indicating Israeli nuclear weapons development from the early 1960s onward and had made various attempts to dissuade or delay Israeli nuclear acquisition, none of which were successful. The eventual policy position arrived at under the Nixon administration was that the United States would not formally acknowledge Israeli nuclear capability and would not press Israel to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in exchange for Israel not formally declaring its nuclear status. This arrangement, which was never publicly acknowledged by either government, effectively exempted Israel from the non-proliferation regime that the United States was simultaneously pressing other nations to accept. The arrangement persisted throughout the remainder of the Cold War and beyond. Its existence was discussed in various journalistic and academic accounts over the years, but it was never officially acknowledged by either government. The Israeli nuclear program was one of several national nuclear programs that developed in parallel with the main superpower nuclear competition, and that added complexity to the strategic environment in ways that the superpower-focused planning frameworks did not fully accommodate. France, Britain, China, India, and Pakistan all developed nuclear capabilities during the Cold War period, each for reasons that were partly derivative of the superpower competition and partly independent of it. The proliferation of nuclear capabilities created a global nuclear environment that was considerably more complex than the bipolar framework of deterrence theory suggested, and that created new categories of risk, including the risk that regional nuclear conflicts might draw in the superpowers in ways that were not anticipated by either side's planning. The management of nuclear-armed regional allies was itself a persistent challenge for both superpowers. The United States maintained nuclear weapons in Europe under arrangements that gave NATO allies some role in their potential use through what were called dual-key arrangements. The political management of Allied concerns about American commitment to their defense required maintaining deployed nuclear weapons in Europe, which created operational and safety challenges that were managed through procedures that were classified. The specific arrangements for nuclear sharing within NATO, including the precise procedures under which Allied aircraft might deliver American nuclear weapons, were not publicly detailed for most of the Cold War period. Throughout the period, both superpowers maintained intelligence programs designed to monitor each other's nuclear forces, targeting, and alert levels. These programs involved technical collection through satellite reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and a range of other means, as well as human intelligence collected from sources within the adversary's military and intelligence services. The combination of technical and human intelligence produced a picture of the adversary's nuclear capabilities that was in some respects detailed and in others fragmentary. The gaps in the picture were themselves significant because they created areas of uncertainty that planning had to account for. The uncertainties were managed through conservative planning assumptions, which typically meant assuming that the adversary's capabilities were at the high end of the estimated range. This conservatism contributed to the arms race dynamic because each side's planning assumptions about the other's capabilities drove requirements that produced the very capabilities being assumed. The arms race dynamic was understood at the time as a structural feature of the nuclear competition, and multiple attempts were made to negotiate its management. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, which produced agreements in 1972 and 1979, established numerical ceilings on certain categories of strategic weapons. The negotiations were complex, technically demanding, and politically difficult on both sides. The agreements reached were partial, covering some weapon systems and not others, and their implementation required ongoing verification mechanisms that were themselves politically contentious. The intelligence collection activities used to verify treaty compliance were never publicly detailed, because their disclosure would have revealed collection methods and capabilities that both sides preferred to protect. The result was an arms control regime that was publicly presented as a system of mutual verification, but that operated through intelligence collection methods that neither side publicly acknowledged. The Strategic Defense Initiative announced by President Reagan in 1983 represented a fundamental challenge to the arms control framework that had been developed over the previous decade. The initiative proposed to develop defensive systems capable of intercepting Soviet ballistic missiles, which, if successful, would have negated the Soviet deterrent and thereby overturned the mutual vulnerability that was the foundation of deterrence as it had been practiced. The Soviets responded with a combination of public opposition, accelerated offensive missile programs designed to overwhelm any conceivable defense, and their own research into comparable defensive technologies. The SDI program produced significant expenditures and significant research, but did not produce a deployed defensive system during the Cold War period. Its impact on Soviet behavior, and specifically on the Soviet leadership's assessment of American intentions, was significant and contributed to the atmosphere of the mid-1980s that produced the Able Archer concerns described earlier. The final years of the Cold War produced a series of operations that illustrated both the persistence of the covert competition and the degree to which the institutional frameworks that had developed over 4 decades had acquired a momentum independent of the political decisions being made at the leadership level. While Gorbachev and Reagan were meeting at summit conferences and negotiating arms reduction agreements, the intelligence services of both nations were continuing to collect against each other's programs. The nuclear forces were maintaining their alert postures, and the military planners were continuing to update war plans that contemplated scenarios ranging from conventional conflict in Europe to full-scale nuclear exchange. The institutions that had been built to fight the Cold War did not demobilize when the political leadership decided to reduce tensions. They continued operating according to their own internal logic, adjusted at the margins but not transformed. One of the more striking illustrations of this institutional persistence was the American practice of maintaining detailed planning for nuclear war against the Soviet Union, right up to and beyond the Soviet Union's dissolution. The war plans were updated routinely, and the routine continued even as the entity against which the plans had been developed was ceasing to exist. When the Soviet Union formally dissolved on December 25, 1991, the American strategic forces were on alert. The war plans were current. The targeting databases were maintained. The institutional apparatus of the nuclear competition survived the political event that had nominally ended the competition that had produced it. The period following the Soviet collapse produced a range of new problems derived from the Cold War institutional legacy. The nuclear weapons of the former Soviet Union were distributed across multiple newly independent states, and the security of those weapons during the transition period was uncertain in ways that were alarming to American planners. Programs were developed to assist with the consolidation and security of former Soviet nuclear materials, programs that involved American access to former Soviet facilities and that required a degree of cooperation between former adversaries that would have been inconceivable a few years earlier. These programs produced genuine improvements in the security of former Soviet nuclear materials, but they operated against a background of institutional decay, economic crisis, and political uncertainty in the former Soviet states that made the security environment persistently difficult. The intelligence services that had been built to compete against each other during the Cold War did not transform easily into cooperative partners. The KGB was reorganized and renamed, but many of its personnel and much of its institutional culture persisted in its successor organizations. The CIA continued collecting intelligence against Russian targets because Russian capabilities remained significant and Russian intentions were uncertain. The military forces of both nations maintained strategic postures that retained significant nuclear capability and the alert procedures associated with it. The physical infrastructure of the Cold War competition, including the command bunkers, the communication systems, the alert bases, and the weapons themselves, remained largely in place. The Cold War ended not with the resolution of the problems that had produced it, but with the economic and political collapse of one of the parties. The systems built to manage the competition did not end with the competition. They persisted, were partially modified, and in many cases continued to function in forms recognizable from the Cold War period. The nuclear weapons remain. The command and control systems remain. The procedures for managing nuclear alerts and responding to warning indicators remain. The institutional cultures that developed during 4 decades of continuous covert conflict remain embedded in the organizations that conduct national security activities. What ended in 1991 was a particular political configuration and a particular economic system. What did not end was the machinery built in response to them. The 23 operations described here represent a selection from a much larger record that remains partially classified and partially unexamined. They were chosen not because they were the most dramatic or the most deadly, though some of them qualify on both counts, but because they illustrate most clearly the central features of the Cold War as it was actually conducted: the systematic production of secrecy as an administrative function, the transfer of strategic judgment to automated systems, the role of individual decisions made in conditions of incomplete information and institutional pressure, and the recurring gap between the public narrative of controlled deterrence and the actual record of accidents, miscalculations, and near misses. The Cold War was not a period of managed peace. It was a period of continuous, covert conflict conducted by institutions that had been designed to function without public accountability and that largely succeeded in doing so. The machinery of that conflict did not stop running when the political confrontation that produced it came to an end. It adjusted, reduced its visible footprint in some areas, and continued.